Welcome to episode 8 of Twisted Tales, a channel that focuses on the paranormal, supernatural, and downright sketchy stuff in the world around us. Today, we bring you Albany Convict Jail, Western Australia. So sit back, enjoy and subscribe, but above all, don't fall asleep. Between the late 18th and mid-20th centuries, the British transported over 250,000 convicts to colonies and settlements including in Australia, the Andaman Islands, Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia. So-called penal colony or exile colony is a settlement used to exile prisoners and separate them from the general population by placing them in a remote location, often an island or distant colonial territory. Although the term can be used to refer to a correctional facility located in a remote location, it is more commonly used to refer to communities of prisoners, overseen by wardens or governors having absolute authority. Historically, penal colonies have often been used for penal labor in an economically underdeveloped part of a state's, usually colonial, and on a far larger scale than a prison farm. With the passage of the Transportation Act 1717, the British government initiated the penal transportation of indentured servants to Britain's colonies in the Americas, although none of the North American colonies were solely penal colonies. British merchants would be in charge of transporting the convicts across the Atlantic to the colonies where they would be auctioned off to planters. Many of the indentured servants were sentenced to 7-year terms, which gave rise to the colloquial term, His Majesty's 7-year passengers. It is estimated that between 1718 and 1776, about 30,000 convicts were transported to at least 9 of the continental colonies, whereas between 1700 and 1775, about 250,000 to 300,000 white immigrants came to the mainland of North America as a whole. More than 2/3 of these felons were transported to the Chesapeake to work for Southern landowners. In Maryland, during the 30 years before 1776, convicts composed more than 1/4 of all immigrants. However, it is commonly maintained that the vast majority of felons taken to America were political criminals, not those guilty of social crimes such as theft. For example, it was noted of Virginia that the crimes of which they were convicted were chiefly political, and the number transported for social crimes was never considerable. The colony of Georgia, by contrast, was planned by James Oglethorpe, specifically to take in debtors and other social criminals. Oglethorpe referred to them as the worthy poor, in a philanthropic effort to create a rehabilitative colony where prisoners could earn a second chance at life, learning trades and working off their debts. The success of Oglethorpe's vision is debated. When routes to the Americas closed after the outbreak of American Revolutionary War in 1776, British prisons started to become overcrowded. Since immediate stopgap measures proved themselves ineffective, in 1785 Britain decided to use parts of what is now known as Australia as penal settlements, becoming the first colonies in the British Empire, founded solely to house convicts. Leaving Portsmouth, England on the 13th of May 1787, the First Fleet transported the first 800 convicts and 250 Marines to Botany Bay. Between 1788 and 1868, about 162,000 convicts were transported from Great Britain and Ireland to various penal colonies in Australia. Australian penal colonies in late 18th century included Norfolk Island in New South Wales, and in early 19th century also Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, and Moreton Bay in Queensland. And so now, Albany Convict Jail is born. The jail was established in 1852 for imperial convicts transported to Albany, Western Australia, as skilled laborers. It initially consisted of a cell block for convicted men and quarters for the warden. The jail was built with rehabilitation as a key principle, and served not only to house inmates but as a hiring depot. Convicts who were sentenced to transportation from England from between 1850 and 1868 often served their time in the jail. Many of the convicts arriving had their ticket of leave and were hired to work by the free settlers. Many worked on building the town jetty, manning the pilot boat, and building the road to Perth. The jail was extended in 1873 to become a public prison with women's cells. The Great Hall and more wardens' quarters were constructed during this time. The complex was also used as a colonial prison. In Western Australia, the convict system was unlike that of New South Wales or Tasmania. It was based on the idea of rehabilitation. Convicts were transported from England over an 18-year period from 1850 until 1868. The old jail began as a convict hiring depot, while the actual town jail from 1837 until 1870 was on land later to be made into Lolly Park. The convict depot was built in 1852 but closed 3 years later. When shipping increased, the depot was reopened. A typical day for a convict in the jail consisted of men starting work at 7 a.m. and did lots of different jobs. Most men worked for government gangs, although some worked for free settlers and soldiers. They cut down trees, sawed timber, made bricks, built doors, windows, and furniture. Some men pulled carts and others moved buckets and barrels of water, while educated convicts may have been given jobs such as record-keeping for the government administration. Women, in turn, would typically perform the domestic duties to cater for both the convicts and guards. The majority of convicts were transported for petty crimes. More serious crimes, such as rape and murder, became transportable offenses in the 1830s, but since they were also punishable by death, comparatively few convicts were transported for such crimes. Approximately 1 in 7 convicts were women, while political prisoners, another minority group, comprised many of the best-known convicts. Once emancipated, most ex-convicts stayed in Australia and joined the free settlers. Some rose to prominent positions in Australian society. There was only one hanging at the old jail on the 12th of October 1872. Peter McKean, alias William MacDonald, was hanged for the murder of his neighbor, William Yorkie Marriott. The murder took place at Slab Hut Gully, between Mount Barker and Kojunna. To save 10 witnesses traveling to Perth for the trial, they held the proceedings in Albany. MacDonald had a dubious record and was the only inmate hanged at the old jail. The hangman, as well as the portable gallows, came from Fremantle, Western Australia, to do the court's bidding. The last person to be hanged at the gallows in Western Australia was Eric Edgar Cook at Fremantle Prison in 1964. A notorious murderer who spent time at the old jail was Frederick Bailey Deeming. Killing 2 of his wives and 4 children, Deeming assumed multiple identities and reputed occupations, which lured many into his web of lies. Captured in the small goldfields town of Southern Cross, in Western Australia, his transfer back to Melbourne involved a night spent at the Albany convict jail. It has been suspected by some that Deeming was Jack the Ripper. Deeming's case was heard at the police court in Perth and was to be escorted under police custody to Melbourne to be tried for the murder of Emily Mathers. He was transported by train to Albany by Detectives Kelsey, Gurney and Inspector Waldock and received by Warder McGovern and placed in a cell for the night. During the night, Deeming was noted to be plucking and shaving with a piece of glass his distinctive mustache. The next morning, Deeming was put on the SS Ballarat to the eastern states. The upstairs room was built in 1879, after the Great Hall. Although the design was included in the original plans, the exact purpose and subsequent use after construction are still to be determined. It is constructed with a high window and has a fireplace on the east wall with access to the room by external wooden stairs. One theory is that it was built for a mentally ill person. The story is about a young man who had periods of unmanageable behavior, which included hurting his sister. He was incarcerated in the tower and was only visited by his priest. During the times he was lucid, he wrote poetry. Another involved the female section of the prison. During 1872 to 1875, women's cells, the Great Hall and more warders' quarters were constructed from clay bricks, which was sourced from the area now known as Foundation Park off Parade Street. The female cells are double in size and were added in 1874, but had a day room where they were allowed to go during the daytime. Most female prisoners were convicted of drunkenness, prostitution, or other minor offenses. There was at least one psychiatric prisoner. However, she was transferred to Perth. People who have worked in the Albany convict jail and some visitors have related experiences of ghostly happenings around the female cells. These include the sound of a baby crying, as several of the McGovern children died while living at the Albany convict jail. There are theories that the ghosts belong to them. A truly tragic story is of an Aboriginal woman in cell 25. She would lose her baby during childbirth, only to pass away herself. Many have claimed to hear a baby crying in the area, and others have said to have heard her sad sobs and that she is distraught. When entering the jail museum, you may have an encounter with a black cat walking by room 5 and hear the faint sound of a purr or a slight rub against your leg. Being locked inside a reputedly haunted 164-year-old jail probably isn't most people's idea of a fun Saturday night, but a gang of ghost hunters relished the spooky experience recently. Haunted, WA, investigated supernatural activity at the Albany Convict Jail in March, after group members Dave and Lauren Musson attended an Albany Historical Society ghost tour last year. This is what they documented. After an eerie experience during the tour, Mr. Musson was determined to investigate the historic site, which was built in 1852 and last used as a police lockup in the 1930s. I was standing in the corridor near one of the male cells and heard footsteps come up behind me, he said. I expected to turn and see someone, but there was nobody there. Mr. and Mrs. Musson and fellow ghost hunters, Darren Francis and Will Morrell, returned in March to try to collect evidence of paranormal activity. Armed with infrared night vision cameras, sound recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors, or ghost meters, they locked themselves in the creepy compound from 11 p.m. until 4 a.m. Their footage is being edited into Haunted WA's first film in a series about supposedly haunted places. Mr. Musson said they heard chains clanking and whistling within the restored cell blocks, which restless spirits have been rumored to roam for decades. He said 2 people felt a gentle push on their heads in the cell where convicted murderer Frederick Bailey Deeming was held in 1892 while being transported to Melbourne to be executed for killing his 2 wives and 4 children. At the time, Deeming was suspected of being notorious English serial killer Jack the Ripper. Every time someone would start to read about his murders, the ghost meter would rise from green to very high levels of red, Mr. Musson said. Mr. Musson said he felt something touch his head and heard chains clanking while he was locked in a solitary confinement cell called the Black Hole. Being in there and almost pitch black with the night vision camera, when something happens you almost don't have a chance to be scared because your brain immediately tries to work out what it is, he said. Measuring about 2.5 meters by 1.2 meters, the Black Hole was used as a form of punishment up until 1898. While still in use, several drunken soldiers were locked in the cell and one suffocated, according to the Albany Historical Society. Tales of a baby crying from inside the women's cells, which are rumored to be haunted by a young woman who died during childbirth, have also persisted over the years. Mr. Musson said he had been interested in the supernatural since he was a boy, and took up ghost hunting as a hobby 10 years ago. Haunted WA want to return to Albany to investigate other reportedly haunted sites, including Patrick Taylor Cottage and the Point King Lighthouse for future films. The oldest surviving dwelling in WA, Patrick Taylor Cottage, is rumored to be haunted by its former tenant, Major Frederick Ingleby, on the anniversary of his death each September. A former Point King lighthouse keeper, John Gregory Redden, is said to appear to guide seafarers safely into Princess Royal Harbor. Mr. Musson said ghost stories capture the imagination of people all over the world. Almost every nationality has ghost stories, he said. I think people like to think there is something beyond this life. It also gives them a connection to the past. You never know what ghostly things you may encounter at the Albany Convict Jail, but it has been reported that unexplainable sounds both from visitors and the museum staff include wailing to taps and knocks echoing, doors shutting with no draft, to tiny whispers, and the sound of footsteps on the old wood floorboards. The Albany Convict Jail is thought to be one of the most haunted places in Western Australia, and for many who have been brave enough to visit, have reported having experiences that they could not quite explain. Could it be the inmates who once wandered the cell blocks or the most notorious murderer, Frederick Bailey Deeming, who was suspected by some to be Jack the Ripper? Deeming murdered his first wife and 4 children in England and his second wife in Melbourne, Australia. He was captured in Southern Cross, Western Australia, and whilst being transferred back to Melbourne, he spent a night at Albany Jail. Is he returning with a message for a chosen few? We will never know. Thank you for watching episode 7 of Twisted Tales. Subscribe for plenty more to come. See you soon.